In a world ravaged by secret societies, cults, and government corruption, a time where telling the truth has become a revolutionary act. The people cried out for answers, for justice. There were many who answered the call. Together, we are the anti-noti. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Anti-Noti podcast, the show where we talk to different researchers about who study the occult, the esoteric, and globalism. Tonight, I'm very excited to present our first guest. He's a published author. He's co-hosted his own TV show, written many articles on his website, and he's built a successful YouTube channel with thousands of hours of content covering topics such as philosophy, theology, history, globalism, and the esoteric. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to introduce my friend, Dyer. Jay, welcome to the Anti-Noti.
Thanks, dude. I'm glad to be here. You've been really killing it lately with your videos and your cultural analysis, so I'm glad to talk to you.
Thank you, Jay. I really appreciate it. I appreciate that you had me on your channel earlier, and I definitely wanted to have you as my first guest.
We had a great talk about the Templars and the history of all that. It was really good.
Definitely. Well, part of what I want to do with this show is just introduce the audience to different researchers who specialize in various fields. So I'd like to start by asking you, how you do a lot of talk on religion and various topics, but how did you get into kind of the world of weird and conspiracy? What was the thing that kind of started you down that path?
That's a good question. I guess when I was about 18, I read a book about cults and the New Age, and that was my first introduction to the idea of that maybe not everything that we see is what we think it is, that maybe cults have an ulterior focus, maybe they're tools or pawns of other things. And so I read a couple more books about the United Nations, the New Age, in relationship to the United Nations, and I remember reading about how the United Nations was connected to the Lucis Trust, and that they were really pushing these really bizarre sort of Far Eastern practices, and that this was connected to the belief that there needs to be a one world government. So some of those early back in 98, 99 books that I was reading, that was my first introduction, and I'd watched, I was a big movie fan, so I'd seen a lot of movies that also had conspiracy themes, but I didn't really know how to place that, in my worldview yet. I just kind of filed them away and, remembered movies like The Godfather or Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson, or these kinds of things. And right after 9/11, I remember the internet was starting to get popular. Excuse me, right after 9/11, you can clip that if you want to save the
say it on this channel. It's fine.
Monetization or whatever. The 9/11. I remember watching some videos on that, and really what that introduced me to was new concepts. Listening to a lot of alternative media people, and at the same time, I was reading a lot of philosophy and theology because I went to a Baptist school, and then I ended up at a state university studying philosophy for my undergrad, and then English and philosophy for grad school. And what I tried to do was keep tying in the philosophical stuff with what I was kind of researching for fun and on my own and blogging about, which is culture, politics, pop culture, movies, and at the same time doing a lot of this grad work that dealt with like psychological warfare and propaganda and how that works. And so it just kind of went from there into just trying to constantly sort of integrate these seemingly, different worlds. And that's what led to Jay's analysis and blogging about that. And that's what led to the book and whatnot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you mentioned you kind of started looking at films and James Bond and espionage. Uh, so,
Yeah, that got me into geopolitics because at first, when you first sort of get into that stuff, a lot of people, well, in my case, it was conspiracies, and the more the pop sensationalist stuff, and then what that leads you to is that you start to get more and more sophisticated, more nuanced, hopefully, in your perspective, and you start to realize that a lot of this relates to espionage, intelligence agencies, and that kind of stuff, and it's not just always grand conspiracies. There are some grand conspiracies, but it's not always grand conspiracies. Sometimes it's more nuanced with, certain operations being done by different groups or different agencies or different NGOs or whatever it might be. And so you get a better picture of, how the world really works is really what it boils down to. And then as you grow and in your understanding of that field, you can then kind of look back on movies and pop culture and reflect on that, and you get kind of new angles and insights into these things. So, like for example, a long time ago, I never would have really considered the possibility of a connection between intelligence agencies and Hollywood. And then as you delve into that, you realize it's way more intertwined than most people think. And that's kind of what I was really beginning to look at back when I was doing my undergrad was that topic. And at that time, back in like 2006 or 7, there was not very much material on it. You had to kind of really dig for that kind of stuff. There's only a few academic books on it, a couple of them, David Robb's book and Trisha Jenkins' book. But yeah, you kind of begin to just put all these different worlds together. For example, so you hear about that intelligence stuff, and then you think, well, what about the mafia in Hollywood? Does that have a relationship? And that seems a little more plausible, right? We've seen so many mafia movies; it seems plausible, but spy movies too, right? And so what I'm saying is that eventually you can kind of see that, well, Hollywood, as one example, it relates to both the mafia and to intelligence agencies, and the intelligence agencies relate to the mafia. They've teamed up at times, many times actually, especially during the Cold War. So that's what you just get a better and bigger picture of how the world's really working.
right. And would you say you have a favorite Bond movie, or maybe one of the ones that you think most connects to the world of espionage and the esoteric?
Well, the most relevant recently would be probably Moonraker because of what we were seeing come out about Epstein. I mean, Epstein was claiming to believe in the idea that he could kind of create his own race of people, and he was all into biometrics and eugenics and this kind of stuff. And that's actually what the plot of Moonraker is. Now, in the Moonraker novel, it's a little bit different. It's about the V2 rocket program of the Nazis. But when you come to Moonraker, the movie, they make it more so about Hugo Drax trying to set up his own race of people with a bevy of beautiful maidens after an intentionally designed apocalypse. And so I think that Moonraker is really echoes that. I just did a video last week about View to a Kill, which if I recall, that's a short story, which I've read, but it's the short story View to a Kill isn't really anything like the movie of View to a Kill. But the movie from 1985 has, or six, whatever it is, as I pointed out in the video, is quite a bit of parallels to what we see in Silicon Valley. That also echoes is the Epstein idea too, because the Christopher Walken character is essentially trying to do the same type of stuff that Hugo Drax did and Epstein. So those two come to mind immediately relevant. The most occultic of the Bond films would have to be Live and Let Die, excuse me, because that's where Bond is interacting with Baron Samedi and the sort of Santeria voodoo type tradition
Mhm.
in that film. So that would be the most occultic, and then most of them all though have some relationship to real world espionage and operations.
It's interesting that you mentioned Moonraker because I guess I would think of that one as one of the most fantastical,
Yeah,
but
it's really preposterous. But if we set aside the kind of the fantastical,
Mhm.
goofy stuff, you've got that core plot of Hugo Drax trying to use like aerosol bioweapons to get rid of everybody, and then
Hmm.
he's got a underground Noah's Ark type place in the Amazon under a temple.
Yeah.
He's
And
got a
when
bunch
you
of
look
girls there.
deeper and deeper into the Epstein case, it gets just more and more insane with the
Right.
transhumanism and right
Right.
wanting to seed his DNA across the
Exactly.
world. It's really quite insane. Um, so sometimes it's very difficult when looking at these esoteric films and stories to figure out what they're trying to do with it. I feel like, and we have
Yeah,
these different
I agree.
ideas like the alchemical revelation of the method, where there's the idea that there might be a magical power to exposing what they're doing
Mhm.
in a way through storytelling. And sometimes it just seems like, military propaganda, or
Right.
sometimes it even just seems like a shout out to your Mason homies, where it's just nothing but like a pyramid in the background randomly. Um, it- do you think there are also like many good films that are talking about these things? And why are there so many different levels of um, symbolism in film? What do you say?
Because there's a lot of different people that make movies. I mean, even one movie has a lot of people whose input and creativity go into it. And also, movies are made, as you said, for different reasons. Sometimes it might be being made for war propaganda. Sometimes a movie might be being made for corporate propaganda. And these agendas or motivations aren't mutually exclusive, right? It could be both and.
Mhm.
Sometimes a director might have a certain bent on being or believing in alchemy or esotericism, and he views his movie as a ritual or whatever. So all of those are possibilities, and I think a lot of different movies are good candidates for all the above. But I think that if we think about somebody like Darren Aronofsky, he makes a lot of occult movies
Mhm.
that are pretty clearly occultic. We think about The Fountain, think about Black Swan, Pi. These are a lot of Kabbalistic themes. And then if we think about good films, the last good film that I watched that actually had a good message was that pretty famous conspiracy movie called Brotherhood of the Bell. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's like a
No.
70s TV movie that's kind of popular in the history of alternative media and in the conspiracy world because it's essentially like Skull and Bones. It's not actually Skull and Bones.
Yeah.
And it's pretty. I mean, I think they had good intentions. I think they were trying to show how the networking at the wealthy academic level happens and goes on. That Skull and Bones. I mean, that's clearly what's being portrayed in the movie. The Brotherhood of the Bell is. It's not a skull and a bone. It's the bell, which is the
Mhm.
stand-in replacement for Skull and Bones. But there's a great scene. I'm not going to spoil the movie, but there's a great scene at the end where the guy is intending to he wants to get his message out and expose um, the Brotherhood. And the real insight of this scene when he goes on this guy's TV show to expose it is that the TV show it's almost like a Jerry Springer type of show. Jerry Springer wasn't around yet in the 70s, but the show kind of predicts like a Springer ethos. I don't know if they intentionally were predicting it, but and what they do is they just kind of make the guy out to be a clown and a fool on the TV show, and his motivations were to go there and really expose this to the public or whatever, and he realizes that's not really going to work because that approach. I'm not saying that you can't expose things or put your message out, but it requires a little more sophistication than the sort of, if I just get the word out, everybody will see it and it'll be clear. Because that's not the only things that move and motivate human beings. Human beings aren't just motivated by a bare-faced rational presentation of the facts. They're motivated by a lot of other concerns like emotion and fallacies, right? Those are the things that form over content, unfortunately, is a lot of times what motivates people. So that was a very insightful scene. And what they do is they kind of picture this guy as like they have all these different groups in the audience who come up and say crazy stuff and like, oh, you're right, it is a conspiracy, and it's not just the Brotherhood of the Bell, it's really the aliens that run everything. And then this other guy stands up and he says, oh, it's really the white people. He's like a black activist. He's like, all the white people run everything. And then another guy stands up and he's like, it's the Catholics and the Vatican that run everything, and you're right. And so it makes the guy into a clown, and is a very just insightful scene in terms of that old film, because you see that in the alternative media sphere now, where it's sort of like you can deflect and steer people off into thinking that, oh, it's just one group that's the bad guys, and that's who we demonize, when ultimately, it's not one single group that's the source of evil or whatever. It's humans in general that can be either good or evil.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of interconnected
right
agendas and
amongst different groups, right?
Exactly. What you were talking about there kind of made me think of, I don't know if you've seen many of the old like Aquino. There's like interviews with Aquino on Oprah and some of those types
I've
of
seen
shows.
one of the Oprah ones, yeah.
There's one where a guy kind of goes up and confronts Aquino, and he's like, I
That,
was
yeah.
involved in a human sacrifice. And like, it's a really interesting clip. It kind of made me think of what you were talking about. And like,
Yeah, that's like the scene. That's a great example. That's like that scene in Brotherhood of the Bell. Yeah, that's a good point, because that guy, he doesn't seem credible at all.
Yeah, and it seems like they're certainly trying to control the public perception of. I mean, that was the satanic panic era where they were trying to discredit the whole idea of Satanism affecting the public.
Yeah, I tend to think that there was a lot of goofiness, but that there's an element to the satanic panic that was done on purpose to make it look goofy. Absolutely.
Yeah, there was there was some goofy stuff, but I think there was a lot of true stuff coming out.
Right.
As well.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So, kind of shifting gears, something I'd like to ask all of my guests is a more positive question, and that is, who is your favorite, or maybe some of your favorite characters in history who are, actual heroes of history? So many of the characters that we learn about growing up, we get a false perception of who they really were, and sometimes villains are painted as heroes and heroes are painted as villains. But who do you actually like in history?
Oh, that's a great question. I've never been asked that. Well, I mean, there's a lot of people in the history of the Bible and in church history who I would really, be appreciative of. Saint Nicholas, Saint Maximus, Moses, David, Daniel. The patriarchs of the Old Testament. And many of the saints in the history of the church, Saint Maximus, or the Saint Photius the Great, Saint Mark of Ephesus. These people are very important. I would say that probably dominates my view of who the heroes are, but I'm sure that there's plenty of great kings and noble people, Prince Vladimir, or the sainted kings of Serbia, for example. Those would be great heroes. And then some philosophers I think are good. I'm always torn on the philosophers, though, because most philosophers are equally good and bad at once. So it's hard to put them on a scale. Like, is Aristotle better than Plato? Kinda. Is Plato better than Aristotle? Nah. I mean, it's kind of a back. So I don't know about philosophers is a little tougher, but it's a great question. Yeah, that's. I would probably just have to pick primarily sort of religious, theological figures as heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Athanasius, for example, because he stood up for what was true, even when most of the empire at that time had compromised or caved to a big degree on Arianism. So most of the bishops weren't full Arians, but quite a few were under the impression that semi-Arianism was probably true, and it wasn't. So orthodoxy at that time was in the minority, and that's why he's such a pivotal figure to look up to, because I think we're in a really similar kind of situation today. And that's why truth isn't ultimately determined by numbers, because you can have a lot of people who are incorrect. And that's where you get the famous dictum, Athanasius contra mundum, right? Athanasius against the world.
Mm-hmm. And we certainly need people that are willing to stand against the majority voices these days, because
I mean, even if that's a really kind of a basic, logical mistake, is that, appeal to consensus, appeal to, the masses. That's a fallacy, because it really has nothing to do with what's true or false.
Mm-hmm. And
well, we all know evolution's true. Oh, really? Is that right?
right. Yeah, so much of science is just based off of that appeal to the majority. Like thing on the next, or scientism, I should say. It's not science, truly. So one piece of like a current event that I saw that I haven't really seen many in the truth community, or whatever you want to call it, comment on, and that is that the Bank of England's governor, Mark Carney, just came out and said that he thinks that the world needs to get off the dollar as the reserve currency, and is suggesting that the central banks come together and create a new reserve currency connected to Facebook's Libra coin. Have you heard about this? And
I have. Well, I didn't know about Mark Carney specifically. I mean, we did a few boiler rooms talking about Libra. Is this connected to the Wyoming Federal Reserve meeting that just happened?
It may be. I mean, this just came out like
Okay.
within the week. This last.
I think the Fed is meeting at a big meeting, and a lot of people were saying that this is, some sort of economic doom and gloom type of scenario. They were arguing that it was a political move that they want to make the economy look bad, to blame it on Trump or whatever. I don't know about all that, but I did not know that the Bank of England guy said that. But I would say that I don't know that we're in the end times per se, but I would say that definitely seems to point to the possibility of at least a version of trying to set up like the beast type system.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think they've wanted a global currency for a very long time. We can go back to, I think it's like 88 or somewhere around there. The Economist came out with an article announcing the Phoenix, which was supposed to be a currency for North America. And that never worked out, but they have been pushing towards this goal.
The idea has been there. You're right. Yeah, they definitely want to co-opt and have some form of global electronic currency like that. And even you could go back even to Bertrand Russell, who and H.G. Wells that I cover in my talk series, that they were proposing a cashless sort of credit type of system 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that it needed to be global.
Mm-hmm. And this is a necessary step, it seems like, to creating the beast system of Revelation. So I just thought it was interesting that this world banker had announced that again.
Yeah, it seems like the ability to put that in is still a good ways away, because it seems like you need a lot of infrastructure for that, and you got to get people over to that system. I mean, that's what they're going to push, but I still think that it would probably be, it's not going to be next year. We're not all going to be using, having to be microchipped next year to get to buy and sell, but it could be in the next 10 or 20 years that is that they have enough of the infrastructure in place to try to roll that out. and make it mandatory. It's very possible.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that's definitely where they want to go. No doubt about that.
And so the next thing I'd like to talk about is, if you may have seen the thumbnail for this video, and I did choose the double-headed eagle with Jay and I each on the title screen, and I did this very purposely because I want to talk about what that symbol represents originally. And many people know that symbol because it's used by Albert Pike on his Masonic work, Morals and Dogma. And I think he did that for a specific reason. But Jay, can you tell people what that eagle actually represents?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't actually know the ancient origins of where the symbol comes from. My familiarity with it is that in the history of the Byzantine Empire, it becomes the normative symbol for the imperium. So it's supposed to symbolize church and state working in harmony, or symphonia. It does eventually get co-opted by the Masons, but the Masons have a tendency to co-opt all kinds of religious symbolism and imagery and symbology, because Masonry wants to be a universal science, right? It's a universal science of the human person and nature or whatever. So naturally, they're going to try to lay claim to all of the religious symbols and imagery. Masons will use the cross, for example, but because a Mason uses the cross, we wouldn't say that the cross is therefore a Masonic symbol, right?
Right.
So we want to be careful about the genetic fallacy, and we want to be careful, I'm not saying you, but just in general, about understanding that symbols are polyvalent, which means that they can have different meanings, or they can have a different meaning in a different context. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes symbols are also determined on the basis of the intention of the person doing it and in what context they're using it. So, for example, if you think about about a cross, an upside down cross could mean something like the Church of Satan, or it could mean the cross of Saint Peter, because Peter, by tradition, the belief is that he was crucified upside down. So it would depend on the context and or the intention of the person using it or doing that. So those are just some examples that come to mind. Another great example is that the Masons misuse is their misunderstanding and confusion about the morning star, because Venus, the bright morning star in Scripture, can be used as an image of Lucifer or Satan, or it can be used and is spoken of as an image of Christ, right? Because it rises and so forth. So point being is that even within Scripture, another great example, a lion. Satan is a lion who goes about roaring, seeking whom may devour, or Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The context determines the meaning. Yeah, so in the same way, I would say that the reason that the double-headed eagle is so prominent in Orthodoxy is because of that theological meaning of what's called symphonia, the idea that church and state are supposed to work in harmony as two divine offices ordained under God. It doesn't mean that the state is equal to the church. Certainly the church, because it's a spiritual power, has preeminence over the state, but the state is also an ordained power of God too. And that's the traditional classic view. Paul talks about this in Romans 13 when he discusses the authority of Caesar and the imperium and whatnot. So this is just kind of the historic, traditional Christian Orthodox view. But it also passes into the Roman Catholic West as well, because the German Holy Roman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, also will use the Byzantine double-headed eagle. And their intention, at least as far as we know, was just also to symbolize this dual power of church and state. And I think even probably some of when the German princes went Protestant, I think even some of them might have kept that imagery for a while. But ultimately, as Freemasonry comes into the fore, when they co-opt it into, as you mentioned, it's symbolizing the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite, right, and above, which is ordo out of chaos. And so it's supposed to symbolize duality, and it's supposed to symbolize sort of the Gnostic principle of good and evil, black and white, etc.
Yeah, and I think that what you were talking about with particularly the lion example in the Bible is a very good example of everything that Satan is trying to do in the Bible, and like in terms of the realm of the occult, it seems like everything is a bastardization of what God does and of what Christendom is.
Hmm.
And so you do see a lot of sometimes similar symbolism, but they're being used in different ways. They're being twisted. And I would argue that the I think they use the double-headed eagle because of Masons also talk about, Pike talks about it specifically, that Masons are sworn to overthrow throne and altar.
Hmm.
And I think that that is why they use the double-headed eagle, because they are not just trying to overthrow it, but they're trying to replace it. Um,
That's a good point. Yeah, and it's the intention is to replace it with the Platonic idea, which is the Republic.
mhm. And this is also to, these two heads in a way it makes me think of just two pieces of history that are left out of our education, both in how the Masons use this symbol. We don't learn about secret societies and their vast impact on
Hmm.
history,
Hmm.
but we're also uh, in the West. We really do not learn about the history of the Byzantine Empire and of
Right.
Orthodoxy at all. And these are two huge blank spots that we have. And it's almost like a false dichotomy that we have of
Yeah.
Protestantism versus Catholicism,
Right.
where we're not even considering so much of the history of the church in what's going on. Um, so I guess
No,
that's
I don't. I couldn't say it any better. I mean, I don't know for sure if there was any intentional, but I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't intentional to keep the West kind of ignorant on the idea of Byzantium, because Byzantium was the world's most successful empire, um, for and longest running. Had the most successful economic system and so forth for many, many, many centuries. Of course, doesn't mean it was that it was flawless. It had plenty of flaws, and eventually it crumbled. But it's still is curious that Western education has for so long kind of ignored this. But when I was doing my undergrad, I wasn't really into Byzantium, but I was interested in the history of the church, and I noticed that in my undergrad curricula there was a curious gap that where we would study Plato and the Greeks, and then you jump, and maybe a little bit of like the Stoics, but you jump to Descartes.
Mhm.
And I had to actually, I specifically requested a medieval philosophy class, which they actually did it a couple semesters later because I requested it. Um, but there would have been absolutely no, because the assumption is that why does any of that matter? Because Descartes kind of kicks off the Enlightenment scientific revolution in many ways. So
Mhm.
therefore, we know that what's the point of all this religious gobbledygook from the time of the birth of Christ and the church fathers up to the Middle Ages? That's a bunch of nonsense.
Mhm. Yeah. And
And that was in the undergrad curriculum. Like you could have gone through the totality of the philosophy program and not had any exposure to any medieval philosophy.
right, it's often just a big blank spot in our philosophy and in our history. Um, a huge blank spot.
Yeah, I mean, I did a history minor, and I was one or two classes from being a double major. And I don't remember. We had I had a medieval lit class, but I don't think that was even attached to history.
Hmm.
I didn't have anything about Byzantium. The closest thing to Byzantium was a history of Islam class I took, and that was just about how the Crusades were illegitimate.
Hmm. For a long time, I was as I started digging into this world of secret societies and the occult, I was very annoyed with Christendom for generally ignoring the fact that we have Luciferian cults kind of running our society, and that Masonry built this America essentially, and for the most part, it seems like Protestantism ignores this. But historically, that's another thing where I think why we haven't heard as much about this. Orthodoxy and Catholicism have stood against these secret societies for the most part, um, and we've been kind of kept ignorant to this whole battle of uh, good and evil.
Yeah, I think that the founding of America is a curious, bizarre kind of mix of a lot of different ideologies. You've got Baptists there,
Mhm.
you've got a couple Catholics with like the Carols, and you've got a lot of Episcopalians, Congregationalists, people who were even still back then pro-British, a couple monarchists in the mix. I mean, it's got a lot of influence from Protestantism, from the Enlightenment. And as you said, also an undercurrent, obviously, of a lot of Freemasonry. So there's a lot of weird confluences there that go into America. I mean, when we talk about the documents, we're talking about, English common law, Roman common law, biblical law, um, um, medieval law, um, all kind of going into this mix and blending it with um, John Locke. It was at the beginning of Jefferson is kind of like borrowing from Locke directly, if I recall. And then
Mhm.
there's also influence too from like the Italian republics. Like I didn't even know this until a couple years ago when I wrote a couple essays on Machiavelli. That actually Machiavelli was pretty influential on the founding fathers because he was arguing for the Italian Republic, right? So if the founding fathers obviously being interested in establishing a republic, they would be looking back to not just Plato's Republic, but also the Italian Republic and Machiavelli, which I didn't even know about until I read Machiavelli's Art of War and one of his essays on republicanism. So there's a lot of weird influences, but
Mhm.
you're absolutely right that what really seems to be the motivation seems to be the spirit of the Enlightenment and the liberty, equality, fraternity of Freemasonry.
Mhm.
Even though what liberty, equality, and fraternity means to the Jacobins and the French revolutionaries is different than what it meant to the founding fathers of America. It's still kind of the same revolutionary ethos and just another flavor of it.
Right, right. I, I do find it interesting to look at kind of the strange alliance that was formed between Masonry and Protestantism on some level, because both of them were standing against the Catholic Church, both
Right.
wanted to get away and make their own society. And so I don't think that, I'm not saying that all Protestants were trying to help Masonry,
Hmm.
but like Masonry couldn't really have pulled off the construction of America in the way that they did without Protestantism, and so it's kind of simultaneously a Protestant and Masonic nation that's birthed at the same time. It seems like.
That's true. True. But one thing I will say for the founding fathers was that I'm not advocating the Freemasonic philosophy,
Mhm.
but many of them were hip to the banksters, so they understood like the Bank of England and the international banking houses at that time had a lot of power. So we can give them credit in that area. And also one thing I'll say too is that although again I also don't accept Freemasonry, I've really tweaked my view on the papacy in the last several years because for many years, especially when I was very interested in Catholicism and traditional Catholicism, I saw this as kind of a war between Freemasons and the papacy. And there's a degree to which that's true, but I've now kind of modified this where I think that neither of those groups was in the right because obviously, the Freemasonic philosophy is not correct, but
Mhm.
I actually believe that the papacy was also very corrupt too, and not just from the time of the 20th century or modernism. I actually think that if you read something like Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, you see that you can really find the same types of degeneracy and corruption going all the way back to the Renaissance. And I think that that's what sparked a lot of the reaction of the Renaissance Hermeticist type people. It's what sparked a lot of the reaction of Luther in people, right? So whereas at one point when I was Catholic, traditional Catholic, I would have been very triumphalist and saw this as like, this is all the evil Protestants and people being mad at, the glorious papacy, but now I see it in a much more nuanced way that both of these sides are wrong, and actually the papacy has been corrupt for a very long time.
Right. Yeah. And I wouldn't disagree with you at all there. Something I've just come across as I've been studying the work of Manly P. Hall and of Francis Bacon and some of the men that kind of led up to and were involved in the founding of America. And Hall mentions a guy named Magistrar Johannes Kelpius. I'm not sure if you've come across him, but he was a part of the Pietist movement,
Mm.
um, which kind of followed the teachings of Jacob Boehme,
Boy, yeah.
which was, for those who don't know, he was the guy who kind of kicked off Theosophy.
Yes.
It was different from what we now know it as the Blavatskyan school, but it was still about what they share. One of the main things they share in common is they both claim like direct connection or communion with spirits or with God.
Yeah.
And that's something that we also see in the Alumbrados, it seems like, and often with occultists. How much do you do you think that there is? Do you believe that there have been many occultists that are actually contacting entities, that are actually contacting demons? We see the word pharmakia in the Bible, which is often translated as sorcery.
Right.
There seems to be a direct connection between all this. What is your take on that?
I think you're right. I think that the closest to that would be the people who do integrate the hardcore, especially hallucinogen type drugs into their ritual practices.
Mhm.
And this is why, yeah, it's more of a shamanic type approach is I would say the quickest path to that kind of interaction with entities and whatnot. I've had a bad trip before. I interacted with some kind of entity when I was 17. So I think that that's very real. I don't think it was just a chemical reaction in my head. I think that there was some real
Mhm.
kind of experience going on. And when you look at all the literature for many years has come out about these different hallucinogens and even scholarly studies of shamanic practices and tribes, pretty hard to discount it all as just chemical reactions, because there seems to be a lot of patterns and similarities to these experiences, which to me suggests that there really is interaction with a spiritual plane that's going on here. So that would probably be the best candidate. Those would be the best candidates for the people who would be interacting with spirits. And so in that sense, that's why I would, although I think somebody like Crowley, for example, was he had an element of being a con artist and a showman to his
Mhm.
persona, but I wouldn't totally discount that he did have interactions because he was a drug fiend. Right? He wrote Diary of a Drug Fiend. And Dr. Richard Spence, in his book, in the interview that I did with him, he actually makes an interesting case that he may have been doing pre MK Ultra type experiments when he was doing his drug diaries, because he's like handing out drugs to people and writing down these experiences. Well, that would have been very useful to British intelligence, right? Because he was an asset for a time period for British intelligence. Um, so I would say that yeah, that I could definitely see the possibility of Crowley under the influence of drugs and his ritual magic, believing that what he's being interacting with. I mean, I think that it is a demon, but in his mind, he thinks he's contacting Horus or Iwas or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm. Something you had mentioned Plato before, and I wanted to ask you about uh, Plato, and I'd like to comment in Timaeus and Creatus, which is Plato's work, which gets into Atlantis.
Yeah,
Uh,
the Crito, and isn't it Crito and Timaeus?
I'm sure that you know how to say it right better than I.
Well,
Right.
I mean, I could be wrong because I know he mentions it in Timaeus, and I thought the other one's Crito, but is that what it is?
It's Critas, Critias.
Critias, excuse me. Okay.
Precious. Okay. Yeah. Um, and so I'd like to read just two very short quotes. And
Okay.
This is the Penguin Classics version. And so this is from the scholar's introduction. And he says, to understand why Plato should have invented the Atlantis story, and invent it he did, we need to grasp the role and the larger design. And I'd like to compare that quote of the scholar's analysis of the work to one of the early lines in the dialogue, um, where Cri Critias, I'm sorry,
Crisis.
Critias. Okay, and Critias says, listen then, Socrates. The account is a very strange one, but Solon, the wisest of the seven men, once vouched its complete truth. And then later, Socrates says, good. And what is this unrecorded yet authentic achievement of our city in ancient times that uh, Critias had heard from Solon and
Mhm.
recounted to you? What is your take on this story? Is there, because it the scholar
Well,
seems to contradict this point that it is true. What is your take on this story? Is there any truth to it?
well, there's another dialogue that specifically explains Atlantis, and my I could be wrong. It's been many years since I read it, but my recollection is that the description of Atlantis is as like a city that with concentric waterways, and I mean, there's nothing. I mean, he might have mentioned, the presence of some of the gods or something like that, but I mean, he says that Athens was founded by Athena or whatever. Um, so I'm not sure. But basically, what I'm saying is that my recollection is that the actual description in the dialogue that does cover Atlantis at length in about 10 or 15 pages, there's not really anything stupendous, or he doesn't mention flying saucers or anything. He just kind of describes it as a very elaborate
Hmm.
city with aqueducts and stuff. Like that's all I remember from the real explicit. So point being is that I could see that definitely being a real city. I don't see whether there's any problem for that. And in the beginning of the Timaeus, Solon relates that he went to the priests of Egypt. The priests of Egypt told him the history of Atlantis. Um, and there was something to do with a war between Atlantis and Athens fell into the sea, right? Whatever
Yeah,
happened, the destruction happened to it. And so the Athenians are the ones who are the victors, if I recall, over Atlantis, something to that
yeah,
effect.
it's about the ancient Greeks.
Right.
It gets into kind of
So yeah, my take is that I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't an ancient, maybe antediluvian before the flood, city of some kind like that, or we just don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't the case, and certainly it's possible.
hmm. I mean, the scholarly perspective seems to be generally that this is purely a theoretical, like an idea that he's using to illustrate
Oh,
his ideal political, like philosophical system. But it seems like it's more than that to me. Um, it's something.
yeah. This is what's interesting about Plato is that a lot of scholars, I mean, they're still debating pretty basic questions about Plato.
Mhm.
You know, like does he conceive of the gods as just notional forms that represent principles, or does he really think that they were gods? Does you know? There people have been debating Plato for a long time, and I'm sure they will continue to. So, yeah, I don't know that there's any hard and fast answers on that, but I can say that I've found some weird scholarly inconsistencies on Phaedo, like the section at the end being left out of the online version that I found at uh, like Stanford.edu, I think, or MIT.edu. It was missing the whole section that was in my old
Hmm.
uh, Jewett translation about where Socrates mentions the higher dimensions and where he mentions colors outside the color spectrum and that kind of stuff, which I thought was very curious. I mean, it could just be an accidental thing where MIT didn't have the whole dialogue or whatever, but it's very weird that the online version didn't have, the full
Right.
discussion of those very mysterious topics.
Hmm. And do you the Masons and the occultists often claim Plato as one of their own. What is your
Right.
take on that? Do you believe he was an initiate of the mysteries?
Yeah, I think so. I think I mean, that's the point of the Timaeus, is that the mysteries that Plato is passing down, he's saying he got from Solon, who got it from from Socrates, who got it from Solon, who got it from the priests of Egypt. Um, and it does seem to be mysteries that relate to aspects of creation. Um, so, what you see in the Timaeus about how, reality kind of being built up from these geometric patterns and structures, the Platonic solids, right, from the Timaeus. So there's something there. There's something going on here. I'm not saying that Platonism as a system is true.
Mhm.
I'm just saying that there just seem to be a body of tradition that's being passed down here, that it does have some insights into nature. And so I would say that it's very likely, yeah, that Plato is being initiated. And then when we read the other writings like the Republic, I mean, he's pretty clearly talking about the need for a kind of a secret society, and he talks about the magic ring, and he talks about the noble lie, and that the inner core, of the philosopher king and his inner elite, they have to do all this for the good of the ideal city state. So that's all very directly connected to a lot of the kind of idealistic and revolutionary ideas that you do find later on in republicanism and in Freemasonry.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that kind of makes me think of Francis Bacon refers to
Right.
this as
New
the
Atlantis.
Order of the Quest, right? And his
Good
New
point.
Atlantis. Um, and yeah, I'm sorry, it was Manly P. Hall that calls it the Order of the Quest, but there are many names for this kind of idea of this
Well, if
group.
you watch National Treasure 1 and 2, that it seems to refer to this stuff. Like Nick, I mean, it's goofy, but Nick Cage, his family actually represents kind of the continuation of the quest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's finding out not just the secrets of America, but there's also this Masonic and alchemical stuff
Mm-hmm.
that he's discovering in National Treasure 1 and 2, and that's interesting because I'm not saying Nicolas Cage is the secret of all American mysteries. Wouldn't it be
He's the key.
hilarious if he
He
was
is
though?
the key.
But he actually does say that in the film. His family is part of this inner tradition of American secrets and masonry and whatnot. And then the second one is where he discovers like the underground ancient city that's all gold, and what that represents is he's basically reaching the sort of the philosopher's stone, right? I mean, yeah, he's finding actual gold, but the great work is the movement from base to gold. And that's as goofy as National Treasure 1 and 2 is, that's actually what it's about. So what you're talking about with this alchemical idea of America is quite literally, I think, the basis for what's in National Treasure 1 and 2. So yeah, so basically, Nicolas Cage, his favorite philosopher has actually been mentioned once in our conversation so far.
Um, let's go. Plato. Well, we talked about Plato a bit. I'm not sure, Jay.
Jacob Boehm.
Really?
Yeah, isn't that weird?
So the Christian Theosophist.
Yeah,
Interesting.
there was an interview. I forgot where it was, either Jay Leno or Letterman or something from several years ago, where Nicolas Cage was talking about that, and it probably had to do with National Treasure, right? Because of the
Right.
alchemical connections with that movie.
It's very interesting. And we had kind of touched on the communion with spirits and entities that seems to exist in the occult, but this doesn't just seem to exist in the occult. Uh, it also exists in scientism, and we see many of these kind of key scientism figures, including Darwin himself, were actually involved with channeling spirits and entities themselves at various levels. Darwin was involved with a group called the Ghostly Guild, for example, which was into spiritism and
I didn't actually know that. I guess I took Darwin to be sort of a quasi deist of his day. I didn't know that he had that connection. I did know that his father and grandfather, though, did have Masonic Lodge connections, and that T.H. Huxley, if I recall, one of them has poems where they make some really kind of bizarre references to the lodge and to evolution. Like they tie it to, which actually makes sense because evolutionary theory goes back to like ancient Vedic philosophy. So you can see how, because the lodge, sees itself as the inheritor of all the ancient philosophies, a form of perennial tradition. Naturally, then they would therefore draw upon the evolutionary philosophy of ancient Hinduism, and even the Greeks had a view of evolution too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Darwin, I don't think it was quite as intense as like some of the channelers that we know of, but he was involved with seances.
I didn't know that.
And so are a number of other figures of his day.
Yeah, that was really big in the Victorian era, the whole spiritism and all that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mesmerism, and
right.
there was an occult revival at that time. That's interesting. I wonder if that wasn't a reaction. I think some people have argued that was a reaction to the kind of the creeping naturalism that was coming into vogue.
Mm-hmm. And all right, so starting to wrap up, I'd like to ask you some of your favorite about these some of your work and some of your best work. One of the best series I think you've got, at least pertaining to secret societies and the occult, is your globalist book series. You dig into not necessarily so much the secret society aspect, but and the more professional sounding aspect of all of this conspiracy, digging into these in-depth book analysis
Right.
that you do. Which of your globalist books do you think are the most important that you've covered in understanding what's going on in our corrupt world?
The easiest and clearest would be Brave New World, Bertrand Russell's Impact of Science on Society, and what's the other one? Impact of Science on Society, and the other Bertrand Russell book that's escaping me at the moment, and the H.G. Wells books. And so those are the easiest, clearest ones, because especially with Russell and Wells, because they're all kind of in the same circles, which is sort of the Royal Society elite. They're all technocrats, and they all wrote those books in a very short way. So they're all 150-ish, 180-ish pages. Brave New World's a little bit longer because it's a fiction story. And they're all essentially just saying the same thing very clearly, because they're laying out the totality plan in these very easily digestible ways. And Wells's Open Conspiracy and New World Order are just kind of shocking, like how blatant it is. And then the other good one that's so clear that I did a few months ago was the Philosophy of UNESCO by Julian Huxley. And that one is just so blatant and clear that he's got like 60. It's a 60-page essay of what the whole plan is, just in 60 pages. And then you've got those other ones that are just. It's kind of mind-boggling, really, that
it is shocking how
that you would have it that blatant in so short of a little package, and then to spit these out, like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have these literal professional propagandists talking about indoctrinating the public, getting into the schools, getting into different aspects of societies. It is quite shocking to read how open they are about it, and people just
what's the Russell one? The Impact of Science on Society and Scientific Outlook. Sorry, those are the two that are really important.
Great. And
now those other ones are the other one that's probably the most important. Those are the most clear and easily digestible. But if I had to pick one that was the most important, it would probably be Tragedy and Hope. That was a big game changer for me. And then you have this sort of addendum in the Anglo-American Establishment, which is, about 300 pages, and it kind of lays out who the players are and what the structure is, more so than the Trajan Hope being the analysis of the 20th century up to the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Anglo-American Establishment, he's laying out kind of who the key players are, the Royal Society, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the roundtable groups, and how that is the model for the CFR trilateral setup in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be the most important.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to check out the Globalist book series. It's a very powerful series, and Jay does incredibly in-depth work. I believe the Tragedy and Hope series is about 16 hours worth of content, just really digging into that book and what's going on with the globalist system.
Yeah, thank you. It took a long time to put that together and go all the way through that book, and it was at times it was a very dry, tedious
Mm-hmm.
thing, but it's pretty much, I think, kind of the master key. I mean, obviously there's a lot more nuance to a whole century, but it's kind of, I view it as kind of the master key of the 20th century because it's written from the perspective of the archivist of the Council on Foreign Relations, right? He's Quigley is the historian for the CFR, and so he's writing from their archives. And the book was intended for the academic class, for CIA section chiefs. It wasn't intended really for mass consumption. They never dreamed that average Joe would be in any way interested in this 1,300-page dry history tome of the 20th century. But really, what it is an apologetic for the New World Order, basically.
Yep. Now, Jay, you've got so much work of different types. You do debates, you do book analysis and lectures on theology and all sorts of topics. Clearly, your books must stand out to you, and maybe your TV shows that you've worked on. But like, what else of your lectures and of your work that have you done that you're most proud of?
Some people might think that I really care, like the debates. I actually don't. I know a lot of people won't believe me, but I don't really like debate that much. It can be enjoyable, and I do appreciate a lot of the debates, but the actual process of going through a debate and arguing, it's not really fun. I view it more like a duty and more like something that I'm called to do. But I don't really enjoy it on an existential level. I mean, I enjoy, obviously if it comes out to where I think I won the debate, I enjoy that. But debating itself is not that much fun. What I do really am probably most proud of is the TV show, honestly, just because as kind of a guy who loves Hollywood, I never would have dreamed that in movies that I would have been able to do that. And even though it wasn't like the biggest show in the world, to have a full production show and one whole season of it, and to be the co-creator, co-writer, and co-host is really kind of a dream come true. And then probably second would be the books. I never would have dreamed I'd have 2 books. And then third would probably be being in the Sean Stone documentary with Oliver Stone. So I would have dreamed that'd be possible.
Wonderful. And for the last question, something I want to ask all of my guests is, what do you think that the average person or that Christians or what can we as people do in the face of such vast evil overtaking our society?
Be very familiar with the Old Testament, because I draw a lot of strength from that. I mean, obviously I'm not discounting the New Testament, but there's a lot of times in the Old Testament where it looks hopeless, where it looks like society is given over to evil. And lately I've been listening to the stories of Elijah and Elisha. I kind of just been playing them over and over because it's such an appropriate situation where they're, even at times as prophets. I'm not at all saying I'm a prophet. I don't think that I am. I'm just using them as examples for inspiration. When we look at Elijah and Elisha feeling like there's nobody else out there. God reminded them that there were 6,000 or so that had not bowed the knee to Baal.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a source of inspiration. So you're not alone. And I think those are great stories, just like Athanasius is a great story for when it seems like the whole world is kind of quitting, giving up, and compromising and becoming evil. We have to just remind ourselves that, that's the normative experience pretty much in the history of the world for God's people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, excellent, Jay. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope that we can have more conversations like
Sure,
this.
yeah, it was a great chat. I appreciate it. I'm honored and love the work you're doing, and I'm glad I could help out in any way. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'd be glad to talk anytime.
Awesome. Well, everybody sub to Jay's YouTube channel, Jay's Analysis, if you're not already. He's also got his website, jaysanalysis.com. Jay, is there anything else you'd like to plug or any projects you've got coming up that you're excited about?
No new big projects other than I'll just be kind of continuing the Globalism book series. I just did Friedrich Capra's Turning Point. I'm not sure yet which book I want to do in the Globalism book series. I think I'll probably do one of the Psychonauts. I haven't done like a Tim Leary or a Terence McKenna book yet, and I've got this Terence McKenna book that I've been reading a little bit. So I think I'm going to do that one next because I never thought these guys. I thought they're goofy, but they have had quite a bit of countercultural influence, and they do have the backing, of the establishment in terms of being the countercultural creators, Leary and McKenna, right? So Tristan had a good idea, I think, to go ahead and try to do one of the Psychonauts. So I think that'll be next. Don't have any. I do have a debate coming up this weekend with the guy who does the channel called Perspective Philosophy. Yeah. And he is a agnostic vegan. And I think he's wanted to have a dialogue debate for a while now. I'm not exactly sure what topic we're going to debate, but we have agreed to do a debate this weekend. So that'll be coming up. But other than that, no, it's just, Boiler Room and the content that I put out pretty consistently. Boiler Room every Thursday night. And, we did do a TV show, but unfortunately that didn't a new one, but it didn't get picked up. But that's okay. That's what happens. So there'll be future projects hopefully. But other than that, no. And I want to remind everybody at Jay's Analysis, if you're listening to this, be sure and check out Eric's videos. He's been doing some really good talks, and be sure and subscribe to Eric. The link will be below.
Awesome. Yeah, guys, and I've been working hard on a series lately on the Masonic origins of America. We started off looking into John Dee, and we're going to continue with Francis Bacon and Manly P. Hall and the American founding fathers themselves in a multi-part series that'll continue over the next couple weeks here.
Cool.
And we've got lots of podcasts and other things on the way, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and to Jay's channel. And on Friday, we've got another interview actually already, and that's going to be with Recluse. He's a brilliant researcher. He has a blog called ViceUp. It's viceupview.blogspot.com if you want to check it out now. But he does fantastic work, really in-depth articles. He has a lot of work on Trump and his mob ties, Epstein and all of his connections, the Knights of Malta and Lace Circle, kind of a Bilderberg offshoot. So that's going to be a fascinating interview, and I hope that people check that one out as well. So thank you, Jay, so much for coming on. This has been a great time.
Yeah, it was a great talk. Thank you.
Everybody have a great day.